Halloween night had always been the busiest for the cemetery. People came in droves to leave offerings, say prayers, or just to bask in the eerie atmosphere. But when the gates creaked shut at midnight, the silence that followed felt more oppressive than peaceful. That's when the job really began. It was just me tonight. The usual crew had gone home after the last stragglers left, and I had volunteered to cover the graveyard shift. Seemed fitting, right? Cemetery keeper alone on Halloween night, it had a kind of dark poetry to it. The moon hung high, casting a silver glow over the rows of tombstones, their shadows stretching out like skeletal fingers across the ground. I was making my rounds, the cold biting at my skin, when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind. A low, whispering sound, barely there, just on the edge of hearing. But as I walked past the oldest part of the cemetery, the whispers grew louder. And they weren't carried on the wind anymore. They were coming from beneath the ground. I froze, the air suddenly thick with dread. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, my breath fogging in the chill. The whispers were faint, muffled, but undeniably there, like voices trying to break through the earth itself. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice sounding absurd in the stillness. No answer, just more whispers. I inched closer to the source of the sound, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The whispers seemed to be coming from a section I'd never paid much attention to, a cluster of old, crumbling tombstones, most of them too weathered to read. And at the center of it all, something I hadn't noticed before. An unmarked tomb. It was massive, the stone dark with age, and unlike the others, it had no name. No dates, no carvings. Just a cold, imposing structure that seemed to drink in the moonlight. I found myself standing in front of it without remembering how I'd gotten there, my breath shallow as I reached out to touch the cold stone. The whispers surged all at once, frantic, like 100 voices speaking over each other. They were coming from inside the tomb. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, as the air around me seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier. The ground felt unstable beneath my feet. I staggered, nearly falling as I backed away, my flashlight flickering. Then, without warning, the whispers stopped. Silence fell like a weight, pressing down on me. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe I had imagined it. Then the ground began to move. It started as a low rumble, a tremor beneath my boots, but within seconds, the earth in front of the tomb split open with a sickening crack. Dirt and stone erupted, spraying outward as the ground gaped wide, revealing a dark, yawning hole. A hand reached out. Not a human hand, but something twisted, rotten, its fingers gnarled and broken. My stomach turned as another hand followed, then another and another. The earth was crawling with them, pulling themselves free from the soil, from their graves. The dead were rising. I stumbled back, horrified, as the first figure emerged. Its eyes were sunken, hollow, its flesh barely clinging to its bones. It dragged itself out of the ground, head snapping toward me with a sickening crack. And then slowly it opened its mouth, no lips, no tongue, just an endless gaping hole. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me, pressing in from every direction. I could feel them inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, trying to take hold. The tomb stood silent, its mouth yawning open. The dead, one by one, pulled themselves free from the earth, their hollow eyes fixed on me. And somewhere, deep inside that unmarked grave, something far worse was waiting. Something had been sealed away for centuries. I had to stop it. But the whispers were louder now, the air thick with their presence. The dead were coming, and I was running out of time. I ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the caretaker's shed at the edge of the cemetery. My heart was slamming against my ribs, my lungs burning from the cold air. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it as if that thin piece of wood would keep out what I'd just seen. My hands shook as I fumbled for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cramped room. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to process what had just happened. Dead bodies crawling from the ground, whispering voices. I had to be losing my mind. But the image of that unmarked tomb, the way the earth split open, the sight of those rotting hands, it was all too real. And those whispers, I could still hear them. Faint, lingering at the edge of my thoughts like something that refused to let go. I grabbed the radio from the shelf, my fingers trembling as I tried to call for help. Static. Just static. Of course it would fail now. I cursed under my breath and tossed it aside. I had to think. The dead were rising. From what I had seen, they weren't just aimlessly wandering, they were focused. Their eyes had locked onto me, like they knew who I was, like they wanted something from me. But why? My eyes flicked to the window. The cemetery lay in eerie stillness outside, bathed in pale moonlight. Nothing moved. But I knew they were out there, crawling free from the earth, drawn to that unmarked tomb. I shuddered, trying to shake the cold fear gnawing at my gut. What was in that tomb? It wasn't just another grave. It felt ancient, malevolent. And the whispers, the way they grew louder as I got closer, as if they were trying to tell me something. That's when I remembered something, an old journal I had found in the cemetery office months ago. It had belonged to one of the previous caretakers, a man who had worked here back in the early 1900s. I hadn't paid much attention to it at the time, but there had been strange entries, cryptic notes about a sealed tomb and restless spirits. I thought it was just the ramblings of a lonely man losing his mind. But now, I tore through the shelves, throwing aside tools and old files until I found it. An old leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. My fingers flipped through it frantically, looking for anything that might explain what was happening. Then I found the entry, October 31st, 1902. The whispers have returned. The unmarked tomb stirs again. I've tried to warn them, but no one believes me. The dead cannot be contained forever. They will rise. And when they do, the keeper must seal the breach before it's too late. My blood ran cold as I read the words. The keeper, that was me, but what breach? How was I supposed to stop this? The journal offered no more answers. Just vague mentions of rituals, wards, and a warning that if the tomb were ever opened, the dead would escape into the world of the living. A low thud echoed from outside, pulling me from the journal. I froze, listening. Another thud, louder this time, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. Then came the scratching. Faint at first, like nails scraping against wood. I turned slowly, my eyes locking on the door. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and then a face pressed against the window. Rotting, twisted, its hollow eyes staring right at me. I stumbled back, biting down a scream as its skeletal hand slapped against the glass. The scratching intensified as more of them gathered outside, their bodies shifting in the shadows. My mind raced. There had to be a way to stop them, some way to put them back before they escaped into the world. But the journal hadn't said how, only that it was my responsibility, my duty. The door rattled, the handle twisting. They were coming. I had to get back to the tomb. Whatever had been sealed there centuries ago, that was the key. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to go back. The dead were clawing at the door, their whispers filling my head, louder now, frantic, desperate. I grabbed the journal and bolted for the back door, praying it wasn't too late. As I burst out into the night, the air felt colder, heavier, like something ancient had stirred. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and from the distance I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. The tomb was open, and something inside was waking up. I ran, the whispers growing louder, their voices no longer just in the air. They were inside my head, urging me forward, pulling me back to the unmarked tomb where the real terror waited. And I was running straight into it. I sprinted through the cemetery, the cold air cutting like knives against my skin. The whispers grew louder with every step, wrapping around my mind, pulling me closer to the tomb. Behind me I could hear the low groans of the dead, dragging themselves from their graves, following, hunting. The night had turned into a nightmare, and I had no idea how to wake up. As I neared the unmarked tomb, the earth felt unstable beneath my feet, like it was shifting, pulsing with something dark and alive. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in total darkness, save for the pale glow of the moon that seemed to dim as I got closer. The tomb loomed ahead, its stone door cracked open just enough for something to slip through. Something was waiting for me. I slowed as I approached, my heart hammering in my chest. The air here felt thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. The ground around the tomb was torn open, graves scattered, as if something had clawed its way out. The smell of decay hit me like a wall, thick and rotten. I stood there, staring at the yawning blackness of the tomb's entrance, the whispers now a deafening roar in my head. I felt drawn to it, like something was pulling me in. I didn't want to go any closer, but my legs moved on their own, stepping forward, one agonizing step after another. The journal felt heavy in my hand, useless. The keeper's warnings, the cryptic mentions of rituals and wards, none of it had prepared me for this. Whatever had been sealed inside that tomb wasn't just a restless spirit. It was something ancient, something evil. And now it was free. I reached the entrance, the darkness inside so complete it felt like it was swallowing the light from the sky. I didn't want to go in, but I had no choice. I had to know what was inside. I had to stop whatever was coming. Stepping into the tomb felt like stepping into another world. The air was colder, thicker, and the walls seemed to close in around me. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, the sound bouncing back at me from all directions. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed down on me like a weight. The walls were lined with crypts, their stone lids cracked and broken, skeletal remains spilling out onto the floor. The further I went, the worse it got. Bodies in various states of decay, some still wrapped in burial shrouds, others little more than bones. The stench was unbearable, but I kept going. Then I saw it. At the far end of the tomb was a stone altar, and on it lay something that shouldn't have been there. Something ancient, something wrong. It was a body, but not like the others. Its skin was blackened, shriveled, as if it had been burned alive. Its eyes were sewn shut with thick black thread, and its mouth was stitched closed in the same manner. But the worst part was the chains. Thick rusted chains wrapped around its body, binding it to the stone, holding it in place. And yet I could feel it breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the body, my heart pounding in my ears. This thing had been sealed in here for centuries, bound and forgotten. But now it was waking up. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder than ever, shrieking in my head, driving me to my knees. I clutched my skull, trying to block them out, but they tore through me like claws, digging deep, pulling me toward the altar. I crawled forward, helpless as the chains rattled and groaned. The body twitched, its fingers curling, the ancient leathered skin cracking. I couldn't stop moving, even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run. But the whispers had control now, dragging me closer, making me stand over the altar, my hand trembling as I reached for the chains. No! I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. The whispers wanted me to release it, to unbind whatever was trapped beneath those chains. My fingers brushed the cold, rusted metal, and I felt a surge of power pulse through me, like a shock to my system. The chains rattled again, the body twitching violently. Its sewn eyes snapped open, and though there were no eyes, only hollow black sockets, I could feel it watching me, staring into my soul. I pulled back, gasping, as the whispers twisted into something else, laughter. A deep guttural sound that reverberated through the tomb. The corpse smiled beneath its stitched mouth, a slow, grotesque curl of blackened lips. Behind me, the groaning of the dead grew louder. I turned to see them, dozens of them, crawling into the tomb, their broken, decaying bodies pulling themselves closer. They were all coming for me, and in their eyes I saw something terrifying. They weren't mindless. They were following orders. The thing on the altar shifted again, the chains rattling violently now. It was breaking free. I had to stop it. I had to find a way to stop this. But my mind was clouded, my body sluggish, the whispers tearing at my thoughts. The journal. There had to be something in the journal, some way to stop this. I fumbled with it, flipping through the pages, desperate, as the dead closed in around me. Then I found it. The last entry, scrawled hastily at the bottom of the page. Asterisk, do not release the one bound by chains. If it wakes, the keeper must sacrifice their own blood to seal the tomb once more. Asterisk, I froze. My blood? That was the only way to stop it? I looked up, the corpse on the altar pulling against its chains, the dead closing in, and I realized with horror that I had no choice. But I couldn't do it. Before I could decide, the stitched mouth of the corpse split open, and the sound that came out wasn't human. It was hungry, and the dead weren't coming for me anymore. They were coming. I was just a bystander in something far worse than I had ever imagined. The realization hit me like a wave of ice water. The dead weren't trying to attack me, they were trying to stop it, the thing bound to the altar. But they were too late. The chains rattled violently now, the corpse's stitched mouth yawning wide, emitting a sound that wasn't a scream, but a deep, guttural roar, like the earth itself was splitting open. I had to act, and I had to act now. The journal had said that only my blood could seal the tomb once more. But the thought of it, giving my life to stop whatever this thing was, froze me in place. I wasn't ready to die, but as I looked at the decaying bodies crawling toward the altar, their hollow eyes fixed not on me, but on the thing that had been sealed away for centuries, I knew I had no other choice. If it broke free, the world beyond the cemetery gates would face something far worse than death. I gripped the journal tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. There had to be another way. There always was, right? I scanned the pages, flipping through them frantically, the dead inching closer, their groans filling the air. And then I saw it, scribbled in the margin of the final page, almost as an afterthought. The keeper must offer a sacrifice, but it need not be death. Blood freely given can bind as well as break. Asterisk hope surged through me. Blood freely given. I didn't have to die, I just had to act. But I had to do it now. The corpse was stirring violently, the chains snapping, one by one, the last remnants of its prison disintegrating as its hollow eyes turned toward me. I fumbled for my knife, the small blade I kept for practical work, and without thinking, I sliced across my palm. Blood welled up instantly, warm and thick, and I stepped forward, closer to the altar, closer to the thing that was almost free. The dead parted as I approached, their twisted, rotting bodies making way for me. It was as if they understood. This was my role, my responsibility. The whispers were deafening now, swirling around me, inside me, but instead of fear, I felt something else. Purpose. With shaking hands, I reached out and pressed my bleeding palm against the cold stone of the altar. The moment my blood touched it, the tomb trembled violently. A surge of energy rippled through the air, and the corpse on the altar let out an ear-piercing shriek, its hollow eyes widening in rage. The ground beneath us cracked, and the dead began to wail, their voices joining the chorus of whispers. But I didn't stop. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the stone, feeling the warmth of my blood seep into the cracks. The corpse thrashed, pulling against the remaining chains with a force that made the stone beneath it buckle. For a moment I thought it might be too late, that the thing would break free despite my efforts. But then slowly the chains began to glow. A brilliant, blinding light erupted from the altar, searing the air, and the corpse screamed, a sound so unearthly, so filled with rage and despair, that I almost pulled back. But I didn't. I stayed there, hand pressed to the stone as the light grew brighter, the chains tightening once more around the body. The dead around me groaned, their bodies disintegrating into dust as the force of the ritual grew stronger. Then with a final, ear-splitting crack, the tomb sealed itself shut. The light vanished, the whispers ceased, and the corpse on the altar went still. The chains were whole again, binding it tightly to the stone, and the unnatural energy that had filled the air dissipated like mist in the morning sun. It was over. I fell to my knees, gasping, my hands still bleeding, but the wound already beginning to close. The dead were gone, nothing left of them but the disturbed earth where they had risen. The cemetery was silent once more, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. I stood shakily, my legs weak beneath me. The tomb was sealed, the evil contained once more. And somehow I had survived. I hadn't given my life, but I had given enough. As I walked back through the cemetery, the air felt lighter, almost peaceful. The weight that had pressed down on the place was gone, lifted with the closing of the tomb. The souls of the dead had returned to their rest, and whatever had been stirring in that unmarked grave was sealed away again, hopefully for good this time. By the time I reached the gates, dawn was beginning to break, the sky a soft pink on the horizon. I took one last look back at the cemetery, at the rows of tombstones and the ancient, crumbling crypts. It seemed different now, quieter, less foreboding. The whispers were gone, but I knew my role wasn't over. I was still the keeper, and it would be my duty to watch over this place, to ensure that what had happened tonight never happened again. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid. I smiled, despite the exhaustion pulling at me, and stepped through the gates, leaving the cemetery behind me, at least for now. It was over, and for once, the living had won.